understand that you were walking through Lafayette Park on March 1st, 1961, and actually encountered Harris Wofford and Sargent Shriver. That's the same day that President Kennedy signed the executive order creating the Peace Corps. Were they on their way to the White House to bring the executive order to the president?
I'll never forget meeting the two of them on the way to the White House, and that was, you might put a title on it, The Birth of the Peace Corps. So when I talked to them that night, I said, you know what? I said, you have the Peace Corps approved, but there are no Peace Corps anywhere. So I said, may I have your okay? Tomorrow morning, I'm going to say that Notre Dame is going to train the first Peace Corps group of volunteers in the history of the Peace Corps, because we're going to begin the Peace Corps training tomorrow morning at Notre Dame. And that would be the first of a training program, and I'm sure they'll wind up having them eventually. They had over 200 of them in colleges and universities all around the country.
Sarge once said that the project that Notre Dame ran in Chile was the most successful Peace Corps project ever run by an outside agency. And were you aware of that?
Well, I hope so, because I got to say that we were lucky. That's the first thing, because when they announced Peace Corps, it was kind of a wild dream. Young Americans going all over the world helping people in need. And yet it was the kind of dream that I think just hit on the button how students were in those days. They wanted to do something special. And so when we got a Peace Corps at Notre Dame, we knew that we were the leaders and we had to really do it well. And we worked extremely hard. But the Peace Corps was right down my line. It was a kind of thing that we tried to get Notre Dame students to be excited about overseas service, to be concerned about the poor. And most great universities don't give a hoot about the poor, but I thought that'd be an important part of a Notre Dame education, to say, what am I going to do for the poor of this world? And then on top of that, the whole training at Notre Dame was right down the line of training for other things we do. And it was just exactly what was needed. And I'd say when our group landed in Chile, they were ready to go and raring to go.
Hi, Tom. How are you?
Great. It's great to be with you, Jacqueline, this morning.
Wonderful. Well, as a fellow returned Peace Corps volunteer and Notre Dame alum, it's truly an honor to be speaking with you today.
It's my pleasure.
Not many people really know about Notre Dame and specifically Father Hesburgh's key role in the creation of the Peace Corps. I know that during my Peace Corps training, that was never mentioned. And I really didn't hear about that connection until I started my work at the Pulte Institute. Would you be able to share with us a little bit more about how all of that transpired?
Yes, this morning I was taking another look at Father Hesburgh's biography, and he described the role he played in the early days as pivotal, and that's absolutely the case. He was working in Washington one day on March 1st, 1961. He was working in his office at the Civil Rights Commission and walked out of his office at Lafayette Park and ran into Harris Wofford and Sargent Shriver. Wofford had been an assistant to Father Hesburgh at Notre Dame and at the Civil Rights Commission. And of course, Shriver was an old family friend. And they were excited to see Father Ted, and they had in their hand a copy of the executive order creating the Peace Corps. And they were walking across the park, going to the White House to share it with President Kennedy. And President Kennedy signed that executive order that day, March 1st, 1961, which was the beginning of the Peace Corps. So it started to work as an executive order. Anyway, that night, Father had flown back he was at his office at Notre Dame, and he got a phone call from Shriver and Wofford, and they talked about the Peace Corps and asked him to help them come up with a project. And Father said he would be happy to do so. And the very next day, he convened his Latin American team, and they began to brainstorm about how to create a program in Chile, because that was the country that that Shriver and Walford said they would like to see the Peace Corps. And so they sent a proposal off, and 6 weeks later, Shriver called Father Ted and said, "We like the proposal. We'd like you to help us start the Peace Corps in Chile." And Father went down there. He went down there with a representative of the Indiana Conference of Higher Education. The Peace Corps wanted the Indiana Conference to be involved so that it didn't look just like a Catholic project, being that Shriver was Catholic and President Kennedy was the first Catholic president. But Father went down in April of 1961 with conference representatives, and he talked to radio stations, and he talked to universities, and finally found this wonderful institute called the Institute of Rural Education, which had schools throughout the long string bean geography of Chile. And that was the group that he finally arranged to have Notre Dame sponsor as one of the very first Peace Corps groups in history. In fact, we were the first group ever to go overseas after the Congress passed the Peace Corps Act. And so that's how that got started. There's much more to that story.
That was amazing. Thank you. That's just crazy how one thing led to another. It's just really, truly serendipitous beginning to the Peace Corps and that relationship with Notre Dame. I also wanted to highlight that in your book, Waiting for the Snow, you talk about how hands-on Father Hesburgh was with that first cohort of volunteers, and that he played such a central figure in your journey as well as your fellow volunteers. And it was really impressive how involved he was, not only in each of their work in the field while in Chile, but also in their later lives. Would you be able to share with us a bit about how he was as a mentor for you during that time?
It started with the training program. On July 20th, 1961, 45 of us arrived at the Morris Inn for a little reception that Father was giving. And the interesting thing was, and this is an amazing fact, he greeted each of us by name because he had looked at pictures of all of us, and he knew who we were, and he recognized us even before we introduced ourselves to him. During that training program, he was very, very close to us. There's a very funny story. We were at Indianapolis getting a psychiatric test. They tested everybody psychologically. And that night we came back, and the Notre Dame was moving the women. There were 18 women in the group, and they were moving the women and the men into Fisher Hall. It was the first time, I think, that we ever had women and men in the same dormitory at Notre Dame. And Father was working late at night, and some young priest, and Father tells the story, some young priest burst into his office. "There are women and men in the same dormitory." And Father said, "Yes, I know, I authorized that. That's the Peace Corps." So he remained close to us. And then after we went down to Chile, Father came and visited each one of us at our site. That involved a trip of almost 700 miles. And he would bring us things from our parents. He actually brought each one of us a personally signed letter from President Kennedy, thanking us for our work. And then when he went back to the United States, after visiting each one of us, he would call our parents and tell them how we were doing. Actually, and then Father stayed close to that group for the rest of his life. Going backwards, I can remember that he was with us. He was not all that well, and he had a cane. We would have, every 5 years, we would try to get together for a little reunion. And in 2011, Father Ted was there with us. And in earlier years, earlier anniversaries, he would come, he would sit on the floor, and he would tell stories to our children, funny stories about what happened to us in the Peace Corps. So he remained a mentor, a friend. He married us, he buried some of us, and a priest to all members of the group, even though there was a Jewish member, non-believers, there were Protestants, Catholics, the group, but everyone saw him as a mentor and a great support.
I was thinking about my time as a volunteer in Mozambique a couple of years ago, and in the schools where I was at, there were definitely over capacity and they were understaffed. So I was assigned as a teacher during my time there. And I was teaching English to 8th and 9th graders, but I also had involvement in different secondary projects. And one of my favorite projects was Portuguese literacy intervention for primary school students. And if you had told me before going that not only would I be teaching in Portuguese, but also teaching the language itself, I would have probably laughed a little bit in disbelief. But there were many things throughout prior to my service and at the beginning of service that helped me prepare for that role. I am fluent in Spanish. I had studied Portuguese in college. And then, of course, as you know, the first 3 months are intensive training for you to acquire all the skills that will be necessary, particularly language skills. So it just makes me think about how my experience compares to that of some of the first volunteers in the field. Would you be able to share with me a little bit about what your training was like and what your service and your work was like?
Sure. By the way, you had a head start with your knowledge of Portuguese and Spanish. Most of us started from zero, and the first 6 weeks at Notre Dame, the major thrust of the training was language, and could be very frustrating. A woman that worked with me, Janet Bogley, I remember once she was having a especially difficult time, and we were sitting there at lunch one day, and she said to me, how can we help the campesinos to prepare for their future when we can only speak in the present tense? So anyway, and of course, when we're in the field, once you parachute into a local community, and that you're left with the only language that can be spoken is Spanish, you tend to pick it up rather quickly, including some of the slang, and but Spanish language was critical in our training program. We also learned a lot about the history of Chile and the history of Latin America, for the relationship between the United States and Chile and Latin America, and that was all very, very useful. Another part of our training, which was unique to our group, was that we were the only group ever to go to our site by boat. And that was a fight that Father Hesburgh had with the Peace Corps. They weren't in favor of the idea, but he wanted us to do it that way. And he was working with Peter Grace, who I think at that time was chairman of the board of Notre Dame. And he also was the owner of Grace Lines. So we went down on an ocean liner through the Panama Canal. And that turned out to be a good idea because we stopped in Ecuador and Peru on the way down and kind of got acclimated. So, and then in country we had another period of training before we went out into the field.
Wow, what an amazing journey. And what about your work in Chile? What was that like?
Well, by the way, let me talk a little bit about the work of some of the others besides myself. The Institute of Rural Education had a series of schools that were devoted to very low-income rural women and men. So a lot of us were assigned to the schools, and for a while I worked out of one of the schools. But my work was in communities and in co-op development. And so I'll give you two examples. There was one large hacienda there, Hacienda Rupanco, and the women and the men that worked on that hacienda, they were peasant farmers, had little plots of land behind their homes where they could grow things. So what we did with the Institute of Rural Education and the team, we created a vegetable marketing project where not only did they grow vegetables for their own consumption, but because the plots were big enough to grow cabbages and carrots that they could then take to market to Osorno, which was about 40 minutes away. And so we created this agricultural co-op, which did substantially increase the income of the people that lived and worked on that hacienda. And then there was another group up in the mountains that had access to wonderful wood. It was called alerce. And they were being exploited by middlemen in the local town of Rio Negro who would go up the mountain and buy their alerce very cheaply and then come into the town and sell it at a big markup. So we organized them to be able to get together, so they weren't just individuals, but just as groups, and come down into the town and eliminate the middleman. So co-ops are a major means of development throughout the developing world, and that's how we ultimately did our service.
What incredible work. I'm sure that experience really helped form your later years. For me, I know that the Peace Corps really helped shape my career path. For undergrad, I did a dual degree because I couldn't decide what I wanted to do. So I ended up doing a degree in psychology and one in international studies. But during my service, I came to the realization that what I was really passionate about was development work. And that led me to pursue a master's in global affairs here at Notre Dame, and eventually my position here at the Pulte Institute. So I wanted to ask about your experience with the Peace Corps and whether or not that influenced your career path in international development.
You and I have a lot in common, Jacqueline, even though there's an age difference. I was a great books program at Notre Dame, and then I went on to Toronto, University of Toronto, and got a master's in philosophy. But I was a great admirer and friend to Dr. Tom Dooley, who has a great Notre Dame connection, as you probably know. And actually, Tom died the day after John Kennedy was inaugurated. But I always wanted to do something similar to what he had done in Asia. And when John Kennedy announced the Peace Corps, I knew that was for me. So I volunteered right away. But after the 2 years in the Peace Corps, just like you, I then went to Columbia University and got a degree in international relations, and then went to work in International Development Agency, United States Agency for International Development. Finally, in 1970, set up my own international consulting firm, which I've been still running for 52 years. I think one thing I could talk about that I think is very relevant to the Peace Corps is that one of my major clients for the last 30 years has been a university in China. And I knew the day that I got the contract to help this university in China set up a Center for American Studies, that my Peace Corps experience would be helpful to me because of what it taught me about the importance of cross-cultural understanding and cross-cultural communication. So the Peace Corps created a total change in direction in my life, and one I've never regretted.
What a beautiful journey. Just the history of the Peace Corps, your life experiences, and how that has played out. But it comes to no surprise. You have such a strength of spirit, and having had the opportunity to interact and have a mentor such as Father Hesburgh in your life, it's just truly amazing. Thank you for sharing all of this with me.
Well, you know, we were among the first 100 in history, and about 240,000, including you, have gone on to follow in the footsteps of that first group. And I think the most important thing about our conversation today is to not let people forget how important the Peace Corps was to Father Hesburgh, what a believer he was, and what a role he played, not just with our group, but for several years later. I think for 5 years in a row, Notre Dame trained volunteers and sponsored programs. And he used to always take great pleasure in the fact that Notre Dame was one of the leading universities to provide Peace Corps volunteers to the Peace Corps.
It was really an honor to be here with you today, Tom. I really think this was a unique experience to get to hear firsthand from one of the first Peace Corps volunteers.